We have one more presentation to go, and our final presenter of the day, Matthew Milan, is a gravity sports junkie and entrepreneur who has spent the better part of his life asking the questions, why and why not? Great questions. And this has led to a pretty unique career, mostly defined by doing all of the things he was told that he shouldn't do or he couldn't do. Love that kind of work. We're very excited to have him with us today. Please welcome Matthew Milan.
Hey, everybody. How you doing? It's a pleasure here to address you, and hopefully we can cap off the day with good discussion afterwards. So I'm going to get right into it. And talk today is about the future of creativity, and specifically my perspective that we need to get better at asking questions and understanding our role as question askers in a world where we're increasingly working with machines in new, interesting ways. And so, I believe the future of creative work, whether it's strategy, design, art, or any other creative endeavor, is increasingly going to be based not on our skills of production, but our skills of inquiry. So I'm Matthew. I like machines. I've always loved machines, actually, whether they're tools or toys. And it's the augmentation, I think, that's always fascinated me. I love the Steve Jobs analogy of the bicycle for the mind, because bicycle is a truly amazing augmentation. And it just keeps expanding our understanding of what it means to travel under our own power. And I'll use mountain biking as a quick example of how augmentation can lead to new things. So I like to think of bicycles and many other types of augmentation that we use as possibility machines, because as they evolve, so does the potential for them to take us new places. And if you know anything about mountain biking, you know that it came from a couple places in the world: Marin County in California and Vancouver's North Shore. And the people in those places really started to see the potential of the bicycle as something that was taking it outside of its original playing field on paved roads and things like that. And they imagined going to new places, and they asked, where do you go and how do we get there? And so they iterated on that problem space of where can a bicycle take you and what can you do with a bicycle for almost 50 years. And for those of you who've seen modern mountain biking, it's a pretty intense sport. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people could have really imagined when they started, but that's part of the journey and the ability to ask questions with tools. And so mountain bikers, they looked at the problem differently through new lenses. They tried to see the world differently in conjunction with their tools. They broke the problem into parts. They iterated on the lenses of how they looked at the world, on the tools, the bicycles themselves, and the problem space at large. What is mountain biking? And so as they iterated on their questions and worked with the machines as they rode their bikes to get new answers, they got new ideas and new opportunities. And I think asking questions was at the core of this iteration that changed this sport. And many of you can draw parallels in your lives if you look back at the history of things and how people have evolved them. The questions always lead to better answers and better tools. So that leads us to ask, where are we going in our relationship with AI? Right now we're like mountain bikers in the 1970s. Tools are raw, they're barely operational. They break down all the time. We don't really understand where to take them. And AI as a tool and as an augmentation is something even more disturbing for some. What do you do when you create a tool that has the ability to generate an answer to any problem? This ability to answer almost any question thrown at it is something that concerns people who do creative work. And so when you have that challenge, maybe the opportunity is to actually to focus not on the outcomes, but on the questions. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to evolve our relationship with AI by getting better at asking questions. There's a saying that has been attributed to Marshall McLuhan, but it actually was a peer of his, John Culkin, and that was, we shape our tools and our tools shape us. And so we're at the beginning of this shaping journey of AI. My goal today is to share some ideas and tools with you all that can be starting points as we begin to ride the bicycle of artificial intelligence. What's the definition of creativity? It's the use of imagination or original ideas, especially in the production of an artistic work. There's almost a limitless set of domains in which creativity can apply, but for many of us, we're probably able to say that we do creative work that qualifies as art or design. I grew up in a family that was heavily involved in both art and design. I spent most of my adult life as a designer. And as such, and I'll be honest with you, I'm biased by my experience as a designer over an artist. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is grounded in the idea that design works really well when it plays with boundaries and constraints. Art is in many ways less formally bounded, and the definition of creativity in that sense is driven by the power of expression rather than design's desire to produce an outcome. To put it differently, artists have patrons and designers have clients, and clients have very specific requirements. My views on the subject of creativity are heavily influenced by 25 years of designing software and system for clients. And so please accept that bias as I talk to you. So I haven't asked all the questions, and I certainly don't have all of the answers. But let's start and talk about interacting with computers. I'm sure all of you have used ChatGPT or something similar. This is Eliza, one of the first chatbots, and it dates back to the 1960s. And from the beginning of computers, we have always wanted to talk with them and co-create with them. We saw them as that tool, that bicycle, and we got really excited and focused. And some of the earliest tools were conversational tools. And this idea of conversation, this idea of creating through a shared iterative dialogue, is part of what makes us tick as human beings. In many cases, is a direct reflection of how our world works. Input and output defines the shape of a system, whether it's a person learning a skill or a stream flowing through a field. The inputs and the outputs and what happens between really matters. And this also applies to machines. Some of you may have seen this before. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the moment that Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue in 1997. It's a pivotal moment in our relationship with intelligent machines. They won, we lost. Or that's the perspective that you see for most people here. You can see Kasparov, head in his hands, a stunned shock of the audience. And then there's that one person, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that gentleman in the gray sweatshirt in the middle, he sees it completely differently. It's not the end of the story. It's the beginning. And for Kasparov, actually, it was the beginning as well. After this experience, Kasparov regrouped and shifted his thinking around chess and actually came up with a new form of chess called cyborg chess or Centaur chess. And the aim was to bring human and machine capabilities together to play chess at an even higher level. And that idea of the Centaur, I think, is a central concept that I want you folks to think about as we look at how do we explore asking better questions. Because what Kasparov did was he didn't say our job is to compete with the machines. Our job is to then take the game of chess to a higher level by understanding how to play differently. And so I'm not the first to make this argument, but I believe that we are entering the age of the Centaur. We're not humans separate from our tools. We're humans combined with our tools. We are a new hybrid. And in many ways, we have been like this for a long time. Some of us believe that in this new hybrid, we're going to end up being the horse's ass. But I believe that we not only have the ability to be part of the brain, but also to be part of the consciousness and the soul of this new hybrid being. And so as we think about this, really think about this as not just a handshake style partnership with machines, but as we learn more about how to interact with them, how we can become hybrid centaurs with them. And this has already started. Truth is, we're already centaurs in many subtle ways. I'm sure many of you have used Waze or something similar, but when we use Waze, we're the sensors and actuators of a complex Centaur that has millions of individual nodes efficiently distributing traffic across a city. It's a lot more than getting one person to work quickly. And the complex feedback loops involved might not be apparent to us, but understanding these loops and how we can shape them is certainly a Centaur's skill. Now, I was once told by somebody that cybernetics was freezing dead people. That's chironics, but cybernetics really isn't about the Borg or cyberpunk or things like that. It's actually about the study of feedback systems, which is really important for us to think about as we evolve our interactions with machines and AI. And so we're going to take a couple minutes and learn about the basics of cybernetics. Cybernetics, in its simplest terms, is just the study of feedback systems or loops. And in their simplest model, there is a sensor that takes in some information, that puts it into some type of controller or algorithm, that puts it out the other end. And in an environment, the stuff that comes out the other end provides some feedback to the sensor, and that's what drives the system. And we can look at ourselves as complex looping systems, and most of the world around us the same way. And you don't need to know too much about the complexity of this, other than to understand that there's essentially two types of loops out there that can be combined in different ways. You can have a first order loop where there's some input and then some output and then some feedback, so that the system, this simple system, can adjust to the world around it. Or you can have what's called a second order loop. And that's where you put a loop on top of a loop to monitor it. And this makes a really big difference because it places a higher order view on top of the system that allows you to change the system at the lower level. And so the question that becomes, what happens when you can monitor or steer lower level loops? And so just like your awareness of your bicycle and its situation in the world as you're riding it, you can choose to steer that bike with or against the feedback of the world. And so you, as a second order loop, something that's monitoring other things, you can steer the bike and you can steer other things too. And a big part of steering things is asking questions. So we live in a world that's now full of feedback loops. It's essentially a network of feedback loops with steering happening both from people and automated algorithms. And we call that the internet. And in the early days of the internet, the number of things you could interact with, the number of things steering with you and against you, partnership with you, was pretty small and limited. And so your ability to ask questions was also really limited as well. And in fact, it was just limited to the idea of making requests, like send me some data that you have stored. But as the network and the internet evolved, our ability to make requests, including making requests to help solve problems. So add this data to a column in a row in a database and return that new data in the context of a view. And so we started moving away from just designing views that showed returned information. We got into designing interactions with digital systems. And today, most of our experience on this massive feedback system is driven by interactions. In fact, there's whole fields that many of you practice that are based on designing interactions, and they allow us to have all kinds of different conversations with other people. But we're also at a stage where we're starting to have conversations with machines, and what we need to do is improve our ability to have conversations with machines. And that's why we want to start the basics. And so it turns out that when you look at the last 50 years of cybernetic research, you come to the conclusion that it was all about conversation and the different forms of interaction that can create conversation. And so when we start thinking about asking really good questions, it's really important to understand what roles can we play in these conversational systems. So we already know this type of interaction. You've got a really basic input and output. That's just an action. Technically, there's not even an interaction happening here. We understand the feedback loops. So you can take an action and it can provide some feedback, change the system a little bit. But where it gets interesting is when you put two feedback loops together. And this is technically what an interaction is. It's like pushing a button on a web page. You take the action, the system behind the button responds, and you both adjust, you and the system, to the new information that comes from that interaction. And when you take these feedback loops and you put them on top of each other, you actually get something called learning. And learning is just a really simple way of saying, I'm aware of myself as a system, and something happened, and I'm going to change my behavior based on that. And so that's all a second order feedback loop really is. It's just learning. And as we know, learning is a critical element of what makes humans human. Now, this is where it gets interesting, a little terrifying. When you have a learning system connected to a more basic loop, it's called entertainment. So if you think of a stand-up comic, you're on the receiving end of their jokes, but a good comic doesn't just deliver their jokes, they adjust the jokes, they learn in real time, their tone, their delivery, and in the end, even the direction of their show is based on the real-time feedback, the laughter from the audience. Now, the scary thing is right now, most of our experiences on the internet are classified as entertainment, and we're not the comics, we're the audience. In most cases, they're not nearly as participatory as we think. And so we spend a lot of time interacting with machines, but not really in a truly participatory way. And so one of the things that we want to do if we're going to really support good creative endeavors is understand that one of the gaps in the system that we want to fill is this idea of how to add feedback loops back on the other side. And that's actually what's called conversation. And so when you have a good conversation with a person, you're monitoring what's going on, you're conscious of what's going on, they're conscious of what's going on, and the two of you take these interactions and you learn from them, and you have this really great wide-ranging conversation right now. Unlike the entertainment that I'm doing for you folks, which is barely entertainment because I can't really see any feedback from the audience. So it's technically just interacting. But a great conversation has all of these different orders of feedback, and it allows us to ask big time scale questions. How long do I want this conversation to last? Small ones, do I want to make a joke here or something like that? And this second order steering in humans, that's technically what we call consciousness, that awareness that we're intentional in doing the steering. And so when you have two conscious entities together, interacting with each other, you have conversation. And so the big question now becomes, are we entertaining the machines and the machines entertaining us? And what do we need to start to think about that moves us to a place where things are a little bit more about conversation? Right now, most folks will say that, don't believe that there's evidence that current AI and machine learning has consciousness. And while it may in the future, right now we have to understand that that is an unbalanced system when we have a second order perspective on what's going on and they don't. So this idea of consciousness and us having that consciousness and the question of whether machines do or not and how it relates to the questions we ask, I think is important to include here. And this individual, Douglas Hofstadter, has done a lot of working and thinking on this idea over the years, and he calls human consciousness a strange loop because it's a set of feedback loops that after a while starts to push back in the opposite direction. So instead of the feedback from the external world telling the system what to do, the system gains some kind of weird, strange inertia and starts pushing back. And this idea of the strange loop is arguably the soul of human consciousness. And he actually uses the idea of soul size as a way of classifying consciousness. This might be a little too small on the screen, but if you look at the galaxy brain size for humans, we have a pretty big consciousness, whereas the goldfish probably has very little. And we get down to the level of microbes and viruses and atoms. There's really not a lot there at all. And so one of the things to recognize when you're trying to have a conversation with a machine and you're trying to limit the fact that it's really entertainment, you have to recognize that there's almost no consciousness there, and there's almost no questioning why. And so the onus is on us, and also the opportunity on us is on us to start asking questions that really fill in the blanks, so to speak. And so how do you get the dialogue balanced on both sides? You recognize that current AI systems and AI systems probably for many years to come will not be balanced. They will want to take a lot of direction. They will receive a lot of information. They will essentially be the entertained rather than the entertainer. And so we need to figure out, just like a good entertainer, how to bring them into the conversation by engaging them. And I'll use the comedy example again. it's just like doing crowd work. If you are a comedian and you really want to bring the audience into it, you actually bring the audience into it with questions. So we want to balance the loops. My argument is that we need to focus not on the answers, which is what the machines are amazing at, but on the questions. And so there's a difference here between a direction and a question. So a direction, you're telling something what to do. Question, you're asking for a response that is more than just giving you what you asked for. You want some level of reflection. And I think the way that I look at it, there are two places that we need to get better. The playbook, which we're getting quite good at, and that's really how to do things like better prompts, asking questions in better forms, really being the programmer. But then there's also the broader space, which is defining the playing field. And that's the place where I really want us to think about when we're asking questions, not what prompts do I have, but how do I frame good questions so that I can then structure my prompts, my requests, everything else in a way that helps me illuminate a problem space. So what we really want to do is start to come up with ways of asking questions that illuminate the opportunity spaces that really drive great creativity, and then direct our partnership with machines and AI there. So problem solving, asking questions, getting answers is really what I'll call a search strategy. And in traditional search strategies, and what machines do is machines will go through a tree, and they will go down and they will get some information, and then they will go back up and they'll parse through a tree of possibilities, and they will do a really good job of that. But what we can do is we can help them expand the tree. We can direct them to not just go into the places where they have been directed to go initially, but to steer them into new places, like on the mountain bike, take them down a new trail or new path. Another thing we can do is we can use our perspective to help them move through the tree differently. So when a machine is answering questions, fundamentally what it's doing is it's going through every single node in a tree in a problem space, then bringing back interesting stuff. And I'm really oversimplifying here. But one of the things that humans can do that's really interesting is we don't have to navigate the tree from the first dot to the second dot in this highly rational manner. What we can do is we can actually start to jump in a very lateral, almost like a portal-based way from place to place. And this is our intuition and our unique pattern matching as human beings. It's also our ability to understand that pattern matching is a really powerful way of directing an AI as well. And so that leap into the unknown, or that place that traverse to a different place instantaneously, is what makes really great creative work happen. It's also something we can do more deliberately as well. The final thing we can do, which is really important for us, is in the context of asking questions. We can ask questions that help jump right outside of the existing problem space into a net new one. And that's where sometimes when you're working with a prompt-based chat AI or something like that, you need to go straight off of the territory that you're in and go find some new territory. You need to introduce some randomness. There's all kinds of tools for that, but sometimes you just have to jump outside, because it's very unlikely that the system is not going to do that for you. So what's a strategy for asking better questions? The first is to look at this and say the majority of your time should now be spent as a creative individual on getting better at asking questions, spending, as Albert Einstein said, 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. And so I'm going to quickly give you 3 ways that I found are useful for doing that. Lenses, tools, and then the one that many of us are familiar with, which is iteration. And so if you want to go deep on this, there's a lot of really great writing in the world of game design, but lenses for framing are one of the ways in which you can take your questions to a much better place. to essentially see the world through different lenses or views. Some of the most interesting ones, and I think the ones that are worth digging into right now, are fiction, storytelling, world building. There's a lot of amazing work being done in the design fiction space right now, a lot of world building space. But if you want to get better answers, you essentially have to build better perspectives to come from. And one of the best places to start is actually in the storytelling, and then ask questions coming out of your storytelling. The other is to really focus on identifying and creating frictions and tensions and contrasts and convergences in your questions. Ask questions that don't make sense. Ask questions that have conflict in them. The answers that you're going to get back from the system that you ask it to may not be what you expect, but they may drive you to ask better questions as well. And in a lot of really great design work, that idea of contrasting or holding the opposable ideas in your mind and working through the constraints is really, really important. And constraint work in question asking, I think, is one of the critical things we need to get better at when we're thinking about how to ask better questions. And then the other lens that I want to introduce you folks to, some of you may be familiar with, is the idea of layering. So looking at problems with different types of levels, whether those are time or speed or space. If you're interested in some of these concepts, there's some great work on pace layers and the speed at which different elements of the world move at. But one of the things that I found is very helpful is thinking about things from different layer perspectives and asking how high up or how far down in my layer of inquiry should this question be to the system. Spend a couple minutes on tools that can help us with structuring. So in addition to lenses, and by the way, as I work through these really quickly, if you want examples of these tools or templates that I have, you can send me a message to my email afterwards. I'm happy to send you those. This is one of my favorite ones, actually. It comes from an individual called Harry Max. You may hate him already because he is the person who invented Sprint Zero. But he has done a really great job of creating something called the desired outcome framework. And the desired outcome framework really helps you structure problem spaces so that you can understand, how can I ask really good questions? Your questions can then start to focus on certain areas or remove certain areas. And if you folks want, my company has created a full template for working through this type of stuff in Notion. So happy to send you folks over the template if you're Notion users. It's a really great way of structuring your problems really well. Another tool that I use that is really quite good is the Rumsfeld Matrix, which allows you to map the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. Some of us may remember George Bush stumbling over his words on this years ago, but it's actually a really good framework for understanding what's there, what's not there, and then looking at the space that doesn't have anything in it and asking what might be in there and how can I ask questions to determine what's in there. And then the final tool that I think is worth introducing you folks to, and is actually a quite powerful one, is Backcasting, which is a tool for not only defining things based on what they are and what we want to get, but how we can get there. And so it's really about understanding, how do I define states and time horizons and risks to be managed and actions, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you take tools like these that help you give really good structure to problem space and lenses that help you see it differently, and you start to iterate with those things together with a system, with a person, with a machine, that's when you start to get the really good questions. So my argument here is that you need new lenses. You need tools that really help you create a lot of structure around the types of questions you ask so you can be very thorough. And you need to iterate, because the job here is not to create the rules for the game, but to create the playing field in which the rules can be developed in your partnership with the system, which is really great at finding outcomes, developing rules, et cetera, becomes very productive when you spend your time designing the playing field and partnering with the system, the machine, the people and machines to create the plays themselves that operate on that field. And so for me, that's really the big opportunity in the future of creativity, is this idea that we are just at the beginning of learning how to ride these bicycles for the mind. And we need to really focus on tools and perspectives that help us ask better questions, because that's what's going to help us develop those great prompts, have those great lines of inquiry that help us discover those things that are in the machine's potential to surface for us, but will only come out if we ask the right questions. And so for me, just like riding a bike, the future of creativity is asking better questions. And I hope that this starts you on a journey towards thinking about lenses and tools that you can iterate on with at the level above the individual interactions with the AIs that we're now quickly calling our friends. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, define the playing field. That's a very powerful call to action. Thank you so much for that talk. It was a lot in there, and I appreciate the offer to email you.
Yeah,
I will be.
good. We've been working on some of these tools for years in our innovation practice at my work, and what we've discovered is that when you work with machines, the need has never been higher to have really good structuring of the problems and the questions. That's where the real opportunity for innovation and creative work is, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk about some specific examples in terms of, especially when you talk about those lenses for framing. I don't know if you can real quick throw an example out there. I thought that was just fascinating, this idea of taking framing from fiction, storytelling, world building. Is there a quick example that you can?
Yeah, I mean, and this goes back a ways, and I can probably talk about this now. But we were asked by one of the large telcos about 7 or 8 years ago to figure out what the future of television looked like for them. And this was a situation where we had to start thinking about what would it be like to interact with machines and all kinds of other things on a much deeper level. And we started that work with design fiction, and specifically asked the question, when we do this fiction work and when we do these lenses, what is the smallest, most atomic unit of interaction with the machine? And we actually came up with a new framework called modes. And modes are these really small atomic models of interaction. And that became the whole basis for how we help them design their prototypes and models for what the future of television looked like. And it started with this idea that we did not want to just go and imagine stuff, but we wanted to break the problem space down to something really, really interesting. But we started with highly generative work. And I think we wrote like 30 different cases of design fiction, which generated about 250 different modes, of which we're then able to pull out the core themes and use those as the principles and constraints for actual physical and digital prototyping work that we did. So not sure if it's a perfect example, but off the top of my head, I mean, this is why problem framing is so good. And I'll be honest, if ChatGPT had been available then, the first thing we would have done was fed those design fictions and those modes into ChatGPT,
Right.
And started going through different types of inquiry to pull things out. As an example, we would have used other tools as well.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to go to some of the questions here. We have quite a few, so let's see how many
my
we can get
goodness.
through. Yeah.
You're between me and my bike ride.
This question is it really my work when I'm just asking a generative AI to do the work? Like, where does my creativity fit into this picture?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I've struggled with it for a while. And philosophically, I look at it like this. The generation has to start from somewhere. There has to be a seed. And what I'm arguing with this approach to really humans need to get much better at asking questions is what I'm really saying is that we need to get much, much better at seeding, in the same way that a sewing machine allows us to produce a much better piece of clothing than you would with a bone needle and thread like 5,000 years ago. as the tools change, we need to ask, where are we spending the majority of our time? And right now, I would argue that most creative folks, including myself, don't spend nearly enough time in question space. And so we don't really feel a lot of ownership of the outcome, because when we work with machines, because we see the machines doing all the work. The argument I'm making, what Einstein was saying, is like the majority of the work's upstream. The majority of the work is the imaginative work around the problem space. And so I would say if you're doing work on it, it doesn't matter whether the outcome is owned by the machine or by you, because if you're doing a big chunk of that work to frame it up, to drive it to that outcome, you're doing the work. And so I see a long path forward for creative people where the work will continue to be yours, I think indefinitely. That's my hypothesis, because we are always going to, as humans, be developing a better understanding of where do we play and where do we put the majority of our time. 30 years from now, we could be in a very small space, question-wise, spending the majority of our time there. But if you are helping solve the problem, it's your work, right? It's a longer question about, the agency of the machine, and do you need to co-author with machines and all that other stuff, just like an art director and a copywriter would do something together. That's a separate question. But right now, it's a great question. I would say that if you're doing any type of work to get to that outcome, whether it's problem side or solution side, it's your work.
Yeah, I have another question here from Leslie. How do we ethically steer this process? I mean, when we talk about riding a bike, there's not a lot of ethics. I mean, there's maybe some ethics around, well, I don't want to steer into this little baby standing by the side of the road, but how do we become an ethical bike driver?
That's such a good question. And way more time than it will take lifetimes to answer that. But I'll say two things which I think are important for me as a designer. The first is recognize your biases. And so you saw up front, I called out, I'm more of a designer and a software and systems designer than an artist. And so that biases my perspective towards creativity. I think you start the inquiry into how do you do something ethically by trying to recognize your own biases. And that's the first thing. The second is actually something that's kind of contradictory, but it's really important, which is you have to engage and participate. And you have to worry about, and at the same time, do it anyways. You have to get in and take the risk. And I would argue that one of the reasons why we aren't progressing as quickly as we can in the area of design and ethics and AI and ethics is because we're all sitting on the fence. And so I would say recognize your biases, but then actually get in there and try to do the work. And I think it's more advantageous for us as a society to have 30, 40, 50 years of mistakes and then figure out how to get it right than to just let it happen and have no steering ability on top. So conversation starts with recognizing your biases and then not being afraid to make some mistakes. And when you make those mistakes, share those mistakes, own those mistakes so everyone else can learn around you. And I think that's how you start to get to a place where you get more ethical outcomes. I think when you don't share this stuff, that's when you start to get into trouble, when you try to hide your mistakes. But that's a huge, long conversation that I'm super passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if it's going to be a conversation, we need to be in the conversation.
Right. We need a forum just for this type of conversation.
Right. Yeah. Following up, I have I think what is maybe a simpler question. A question from Jason. You mentioned some amazing tools. Can you just explain again how we can check those out, like the Notion template, the Miro board, things like that?
You can see on screen, Matthew@normative.com. Send me a note. I can send you the stuff for Notion. I can send you the desired outcomes framework. Harry is also producing a book on this, which will be out later in the year. I think it's called Priorities, because what he's talking about in problem solving is not just structuring the problem, but prioritizing the problem, which is something we don't have time to cover today, but it's a really good part of talking with machines. Backcasting, send me a note. We've got videos online. We've got a bunch of different examples, including a how-to deck from a number of years ago. That's really good. And then the Rumsfeld stuff, I can send you a Miro template. but that one is not nearly as well developed as the other two, and mostly just because it's a simpler exercise. What do we know? What do we not know? But yeah, send me a note. I'm happy to share those with you.
Great, thank you. This question, I think the whole metaphor of the centaur is actually really interesting, because it's often in the kind of the post-human, we use, you know, the cyborg as a metaphor, and but the centaur is like so much more like of an organic
and evocative, and mystical. It's
a very powerful metaphor. And the question is, you mentioned this idea of Centaur as a model for collaborating, really almost like integrating with machines and creative activities. How does that apply to like our day-to-day work as creatives?
I'll use an analogy, a metaphor that I've used in other talks, and how to think about augmentation and the things we create with it. So I love the idea of clothing. And if you think about clothing was one of the first and most basic human augmentations. And when we started out, our Centaur relationship with clothing was just like a animal skin or some woven reeds over our back to keep us warm or keep off the sun. But over time, as we got better at making clothing became armor, and then it became things that helped us with capability to keep us cool, and et cetera, et cetera. And then this is what's really interesting, and I think this is the place where creatives should go with this. Clothing became fashion and style and an expression of self. And so I actually look at it as we have been centaurs, hybrids with many types of technology for many, many periods of time, some to the point where we don't even think about it anymore. And the opportunity here is to essentially develop a relationship with artificial intelligence that is similar to our relationship with clothing, where it's not just for protection or armor or better capabilities, but it actually becomes a representation and expression of self and style as well. And I think that's the long-term opportunity when we think about designing this type of stuff.
Interesting. Yeah. I have another question here. This is from Leslie. How do you know when we've given too much data?
Oh my goodness.
Has that ship sailed? Is that a thing? I mean, is it possible?
That ship sailed like 9 or 10 years ago. As it was, I do a lot of work in the technology and privacy space, and somebody was saying to me recently, "Oh, you know, what about all this stuff and facial recognition?" I'm like, those cameras have been up for 20 plus years. Like, a lot of these ships around the data we use currently has sailed. But I think that's a really important question to ask, because there are a lot of ships that have not yet sailed. And so when you are doing things online, really think about what you want to give up. I mean, there's really good reasons for using anonymous modes on applications. There's really good reasons for being anonymous in general when you're online. And the argument is that a lot of these things will still eventually identify you based on your patterns of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd argue that part of it is a defensive, which is really understand your behavior, what type of data trail or data exhaust you create as a human being, and how that can be used in ways that you might not expect. And the second is to honestly become engaged in conversations at the municipal and provincial and national level around this. There are not nearly enough conversations happening right now that push this type of stuff, and a big chunk of it is going to happen in the world of policy. And I think that we should really care about these types of conversations, and we should be putting pressure on people to make these decisions in our best interest. But we're just a starting point. And so, just like asking questions, we have a lot of catching up to do in this space as well. But I think it's really important for us to become more aware, more educated when it comes to these types of things, because we don't know what's being taken from us right now.
Very true. Very true. I think we have time for one more question. This is a fairly specific question. How do you balance weight between sentiment analysis, topic modeling, and clustering analysis? Like, is that something where you can pick a frame or a tool or a lens that will zero in on a very specific process or type of answer.
Yeah. So when we do this work for clients, we will go in with a base tool set based on the data that we'll have access to. But we really look at it as a repertoire question. And I'll be honest, we have never solved the same problem using all the same tooling. So the simple answer here is to fall in love with your tools so much that you become dependent on them, but rather be open to the possibilities of trying new tools or using your existing tools in different ways. And so I wouldn't say that I have a default tool that I go to. It used to be, the big strategic planning tools like backcasting. But now I basically go in and say, what's the shape of the problem space? What questions can I ask? And when we design projects and work, we actually set them up so that we can insert the tools as needed as we go, because we're really trying to generate an outcome rather than produce an outcome, if that makes sense. So we're trying to work as a team in the same way that we would when we use technology. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and be open to possibilities. That almost could be a takeaway for the whole day.
That's right. I mean, that's why I want to talk about questions, because that's what opens up the stuff we never could have imagined. And that's the most exciting stuff from a creative perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Matthew. We've run out of time for questions, and in fact, we've hit the end of the day. So thank you very much for that closing presentation. So much food for thought there, and you can expect probably a lot of emails following this.
Good. And thank you, everybody, for your time and for lasting through to the end of the day.